many of you have ever gone on one of those long road trips with maybe you were one of the kids in the back seat or you had kids in the back seat? All right, does that picture look familiar by any chance? And what's the one question that's being asked over and over again? Are we there yet? And depending on your disposition, you probably maybe answered in a variety of ways, okay? You could have gave an irritated response saying, yes, we're 5 miles closer when you asked the last time. Just don't ask anymore. Or you might say, if you ask again, I'm going to turn around this car and we're going to go home. Or maybe if you're the compromising type, you'd say, all right, let's play a little game here. Let's see who can go the longest without asking, how are we there yet? And that, however you handle that, kids seem to be focused on that one thing, the destination. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? But that's not bad, because without a destination, the trip becomes kind of monotonous and kind of pointless. And most of us, when you get in the car and you're driving somewhere, you have a destination point. You have somewhere where you want to end up. That was the whole purpose of getting in the car and driving for the first place. What is to think this morning about destination? Appreciated the songs and your singing. If you didn't catch the theme of those, they're all about something that's very significant. It's about our destination, about the return of Christ, and about where we're going to spend eternity. And as we've been going through this sermon series on the first epistle of John, we've been looking at this whole thing of a journey. How our lives are on this journey. We're in this spiritual walk, and many times it's a transformation from a caterpillar to a butterfly. And we want to end up looking like a butterfly at the end of it instead of an ugly caterpillar. And where does this journey take us? How are we going to make this journey? What's going to happen along the way? Well, last week as we looked at the journey, we talked about obstacles and opportunities along the way. There are things John was talking about. People were leaving the faith. They were leaving the church. They were trying to drag people down with them. And he said, watch out for those people. Be firm, be steadfast, know what you believe. And then take the opportunity of God's Spirit in your life as He has given you the power and the strength to do the things you need. Now, he kind of continues with that theme today, but I want to focus in on this thing of the second coming. Now, let me just give you a little bit of teaching about the second coming without going in some deep theological treatise about all the things that the Bible has to say. But very simply, it's a very common belief in the Christian's faith that Jesus will one day come back to this earth to reclaim His people. Now, how do we know that? Well, because the Bible says it. The Bible says a lot about it. Some scholars have looked at it and they said for every one verse in the Bible that talks about the first coming of Jesus, there are 8 verses that talk about His second coming. Another guy put it this way, in the Old Testament, this surprised me. In the Old Testament, they found 1,845 references to the second coming of Christ. In the New Testament, 318 references to the second coming of Christ. So there's a lot in the Bible about that. And throughout history, people have been obsessed with the return of Jesus. Last week, we talked about the Antichrist a little bit and how John says, the Antichrist is not necessarily one particular person, but it was anybody who was against Christ. But in this passage today we're going to look at, he gets a little more specific about the return of Christ. People have been speculating on the return of Christ ever since Christ left the first time. Let me just give you listen to this quote. The last days are upon us. Weigh carefully the times. Look for Him who is above all time, eternal and invisible. That sounds like something someone could have said today. It was actually written in 110 AD by an early church father by the name of Ignatius, who did a lot of teaching. He says, it's coming very soon. Between the years of 1999 and 1030, there was a frenzy in the Christian world about the return of Jesus that came about because of the passage in Revelation that talks about a 1,000-year reign of Christ. So they felt that from the time Christ left this earth, it was going to be 1,000 years, and then He was going to come back to claim all His people. And it became almost a frenzy in the Christian world. Farmers quit planting their crops because they didn't think they needed any crops for the next year. Buildings went unrepaired. Everyday household chores were just left because it didn't matter, because Jesus was going to come back. It didn't happen around 1000 AD. In 1500, you've heard of the guy by the name of Martin Luther, who started the Protestant Reformation, who was basically breaking away from the Roman Catholic teaching in the church. In 1500, Martin Luther said this: "We have reached the time of the white horse of the apocalypse. This world will not last any longer than 100 years." The latest and the most recent, a couple years ago, 3 years ago, the Mayan calendar was going to run out. It did, and that was going to start the end of the world. The Mayan calendar was going to run out. My theory was correct. They just ran out of wall. Okay, and so that's why the calendar ended. In case you want to do more of your own research, I found a website titled 242 Dates for the Return of Christ. So you can go in there and you can look at all the past ones, and they predict some in the future. What's the point of all this? Too many times we separate the whole idea of the second coming or the return of Christ. We put it into a theological compartment. And it's something that's neat to hear about, and you hear they got a sermon series on Revelation or a Bible study. Oh, I want to go hear about that. I want to hear about the end times. And we study it in such a way that it's always something off here. And then when that study's done or when that series is done, we thought, oh, that was neat. Now let's go back to real life. And we never connect necessarily the second coming or the return of Christ to our daily living. That's why I've titled my sermon today, The Second Coming for Today and Tomorrow. So today I want to give an emphasis. I want us to look at how the second coming or the imminent return of Christ, which he says he will return, how does that impact us today, tomorrow, and the day after? See, it's very important that we connect the two. In fact, the whole emphasis of Jesus' teaching on his second coming was not about dates and charts and millennial reigns and premillennial and postmillennial and all-millennial and predispensational, all-millennial and all these things. Jesus always connected his return with being ready today. And John continues that theme in his epistle. That's what I want us to look at today. So in your Bibles, turn to 1 John chapter 2. We're going to look at chapter 2 through chapter 3. I'm going to put on the screen also, if you don't have a Bible, but if you grab one of the pew Bibles there and you want to look, because to be honest with you, there's a lot more in these verses that I'm going to be able to get to. And I know sometimes I look at the verses and I gain a lot out of those things that maybe the preacher's not talking about. And it's about page 215, 216 in the little pew Bible there. Well, this is what John says, and the first thing I want us to think about this is the second coming motivates us to continue the journey. It motivates us to continue the journey. Listen to what he says. And now, dear children, continue in him, so that when he appears, we may be confident and unashamed before him at his coming. If you know he is righteous, you know that everyone who does what is right has been born of him. He starts off and he says what? Continue in him. And that's kind of the theme for the rest of this passage, the rest of this book. Continue in him. John's making a single statement. A simple statement. He's not trying to draw out charts and graphs and all of these things, predict the day and the time and add up the years and multiply it by the perfect numbers and divide it and all the things that people have done for years. He just states it as a matter of fact, doesn't he? Continue in him so that when he returns, it's a matter of fact. It's not a debated thing. It's not something that they seem to be arguing about. It's just a simple fact. Jesus is coming back. He says, dear children, I have some things to say about that. And you need to understand some things about your life today because of that day when he will return. How are you to be found? Dear children, continue in Him so that when He appears, what? We may be confident and unashamed. Confident and unashamed. You ever had someone knock on your door unexpectedly? You weren't expecting company? And you think, oh my gosh, who is that? And you look around at the house and think, oh my gosh, look at all this stuff. And you say, just a minute, and you're running through the house, you're throwing things under, opening closets, you're pushing kids out the back door, shoving all the dirty dishes, and then you walk to the door and say, oh, hi, hey, glad you stopped by. Now, why did you do all that frantic thing before you answered the door? Because you would have been ashamed for them to see what all was around the house. John says he doesn't want us to have to do that in our spiritual lives when it comes to His return. He says, I want you to be able to walk confidently. It's not in a prideful way, but it's in a way of assurance. It's what that's talking about. Walk confidently. When He comes, I want you to be confident and unashamed of who He is. And it's all introduced by that continue. 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 It's a word that means to abide. It means to persevere. It means to hang in there. It means to keep on going. Spiritually, it describes a special relationship with God. If we're to continue in Him, that means we have a daily relationship with Him. It's not something we put on the shelf. It's not something we put in reserve so that someday when I hear those trumpets, I'll have at least several seconds to take God back off the shelf and shove Him back down in my life. So I want you to continue so that when He comes, you can be confident and unashamed. See, the spiritual journey is a marathon, not a 100-yard dash. A full marathon is 26 miles. That started back in the days of the early Greek culture. They started the 26-mile marathon. Just proves that Greeks are a little bit strange. But there's people that actually run that far. And it's a tough, I'm not speaking from personal experience, all right? Now, for me to run around the parking lot would be a marathon. My legs, my knees just aren't what they used to be. But so many times we look at the Christian walk as a 100-yard dash. Well, I'm just going to give it a little bit of effort for a little bit of time and I'll be good. He says, no, it's a marathon. And we need to understand that because life, you ever found life can be hard at times? I remember college, Alex, take this in, it's your senior year. I remember I was walking across campus one day and thinking, this is probably the easiest I'm ever going to have it in life. Didn't have to worry about any bills, the school bill was paid. All I had to do was walk across campus and go to the cafeteria and eat. Go to class. The worst thing was doing my own laundry. I just hated doing that. But besides that, life was probably the easiest that I'd ever had it. But as life comes on, all of a sudden there's bills to pay, and there's kids to raise, and there's jobs to keep, and there's projects to do, and there's homes to take care of, and there's things that come on in life that you didn't expect, and there's relationships to nurture, and all of a sudden life gets complicated. And it's so easy to get focused so keenly on those things directly in front of us that we fail to see the big picture. And God simply calls us in His Word, hey, look up, stop, continue in me, so that when He comes, you're going to be confident. You're going to be ready. You're going to be able to go to that final destination. So, the second coming motivates us to continue this journey. Hang in there, because the Bible speaks of it as a simple fact. He will return one day. or we will go to be with Him before that day. But either way, continue to walk in Him with confidence and unashamedly. He goes on in chapter 3 and he continues this reference to the second coming. And I think it calls us to see ourselves as God does. That's so important. 1 John chapter 3 verses 1 and 2 says, "How great is the love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called the children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know Him. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and that is what we will be, and what we will be has not yet been made known. That's a reference to the second coming. And what we will be is not yet. In other words, we don't have the full picture. I'm not going to have to worry about grape stains on my shirts. All right, someday. It says, but we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. Just get a picture of that for a second. What John is talking about there, he's in the English translation here, it misses a word in the Greek, the language that John wrote in. At the beginning of this verse in the Greek, John uses the word behold. He's saying, stop. Don't miss this. Meditate on it. Think about it. Dwell on it. Behold, how great is the Father's love. Who wrote this? Apostle John. You think he's visualizing anything about how great the Father's love is? It's a word that's used elsewhere in the New Testament, the word behold. Every other time it's used to talk about something you can visually see. Behold, look at that. Behold, look at this. But here John uses it in a spiritual manner and says, behold. And I can't help but wonder if John isn't just in his mind visually picturing Christ hanging on the cross, because He was at the foot of the cross. He saw, He beheld God's love. And He says, oh, so great is that love. And He's trying to communicate that with us. And He's trying to get us to visualize it. And He says, look, behold, stop. Get back in focus to what the big picture is. How great the Father's love is for us. How great. It describes quantity and quality of what He's done for us. Behold how, why? Because He has called us children of God. Now in the Jewish culture, the concept of being named or being called out or being set apart by name was pretty significant. I don't know if you remember the story of Elizabeth and Zachariah in Luke chapter 1, the chapter right before Jesus was born. There was a big deal because Zachariah was a priest and he had gone into the temple that day, and it was his time to go into the inner sanctuary of the temple, and he came out and he couldn't speak. And Elizabeth goes on and gives birth to the baby, and now it's the day for him to be called by his name. And it's a big deal. But the angel had told them, you have called him John. And they brought him out, laid him down in front of Zechariah, and everybody was amazed when he wrote on a piece of paper, his name shall be called John. Why was that so significant? It's because in the Jewish culture, that was the day you were really recognized as a person. And that's John the Baptist was called that day. The same word, the same term, the same concept is used here. We do not have any identity until what? We are called children of God. And we need to see ourselves as God sees us. You know, it's too easy sometimes to take our eyes off the destination and lose that family resemblance. There's a story of Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was a very famous actor back in the silent movies. He was kind of known for his walk, something like that, kind of like a penguin. Had a little mustache, a little hat. There's a story that appeared in the 1920 English newspaper that told about Charlie Chaplin had gone to America and had gone to a state fair. I think it was in California. And they were having a Charlie Chaplin look-alike imitation contest. Now, at that point, I guess Charlie Chaplin didn't have his little mustache and didn't have his hat, but he thought, just for kicks, I'm going to enter the Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest. He entered the contest, and he placed 20th. They didn't know what the real thing was when they saw it. We don't always look like God's children. So John reminds us, again in the final destination, he says, "Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him." You see, focusing on the final destination, looking to the next horizon, helps us keep in line with who it is we have been called to be. And we've been called the children of God. And when we are his children, we need to be recognized as a part of the family. And that happens when the daily life makes an impact and prepares us for eternity. There's a third thing the second coming does for us as it goes on in verses 3 through 6, and that's the second coming demands transformation. It demands transformation. Listen to what it says. Everyone who has this hope in him, that phrase, this hope, in the New Testament, it is used as also a reference to the second coming. It was not something that we, kind of wish will happen. No, when you see the word hope used in this context, it's talking about the certainty of the return of Christ. It says, everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. Everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. But you know that he appeared so that he might take away our sins. And in him is no sin. And no one who lives in him keeps on sinning. And no one who continues to sin has either seen him or known him. John again calls ourselves to this final destination. If you have this hope in you, then it's going to impact the way you live. And sometimes that takes a transformation, a preparation. If you remember your first date, did you just kind of wake up and roll out of bed and like, well, here I am, whatever happens, No. My guess is, I'm not all that different, I don't think. I remember my first date with Judy, just a couple years ago. I had this old 63 Chevy Biscayne. Thing couldn't go over 55 miles an hour, didn't have enough power. Didn't have a dome light in it, so I made a little light, put it in my ashtray and put a battery pack in there so I could flip the switch and have light in there. I can't remember what pants I had, but I had this brown silk shirt with big peach flowers on it. That was the end thing. And I picked her up. I checked out all the movie, listings, and went to the movie theater, went up to the kiosk thing there, and that movie wasn't playing anymore. Oh man, how did this happen? Well, they changed it on Friday night. I checked it on Wednesday night. So we got in the car and we drove downtown to another theater, and we went and saw Dumbo the Flying Elephant. And the major feature was Ride a Wild Pony, see? That was almost 40 years ago. Well, it can't be because Judy's only 37. So, but I still remember all of that first night, that first date, the preparation, the sweat, it caused the transformation in me. And it all worked because she's still with me. So, anticipation of the coming of Christ should bring a transformation in our life. What we do and how we prepare and how we live. John is saying this Christ who was born in Bethlehem and who lived on this earth and went to the cross and died for us, and who came out of the grave and ascended to heaven. It's this Christ that saves us from our sin. And when we have this hope in Him, it should bring purification to our lives because of transformation that needs to take place. Now, John is not talking about perfection here. He talks about not sinning and things in this passage. He's not talking about perfection. In fact, if you remember back in 1 John, he said in verse 8, he says, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Then in verse 10, he says, if we claim we have not sinned, we make him out to be a liar and his word has no place in us. But what he's saying here in this passage is we need to be transformed. In another place, Paul says, by the renewing of our spirit. Have you let the second coming transform your life today and tomorrow and the next day? One final thing, the second coming brings victory. John says in verses 7 and 8, he says, dear friends, do not let anyone lead you astray. He who does what is righteous, just as he is righteous. He who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. Destroy the devil's work. That word destroy means to reverse the effects of. Christ came to reverse the effects of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve disobeyed God and said, we're going to do it our way, Satan took a foothold, and from that day on in history, he has been going along doing his thing. And John says here, Christ came to reverse the effects of what devil has done. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. And I don't know about you, but that's good news, because that means I have hope for living a victorious Christian life. He died on the cross so that I can receive forgiveness, so that I can receive hope, so that I can receive guidance, and so that you can too. So how are you going to live your life? What does focusing on the second coming have to do with today? Well, it calls us to continue to live in Him. It calls us to see ourselves as children of God, just as God sees it. It calls us to be transformed daily. And it calls us to claim the victory that He's given us. So, we're steadily moving towards the destination. And when you look up and say, are we there yet? God's going to say, not yet. But be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. The second coming makes a difference today. Let's pray.